Sure. Thank you for the introduction. And yes, we do a lot of research with stroke and brain injury. I do focus on cognitive communication deficits and aphasia after that, after brain injury, and also have collaborations that are looking at other deficits in different domains, multisensory, physical, etc. And we do a lot of work with transcranial direct current stimulation, and also looking at blood flow and changes in blood flow after brain injury, and what that might tell us about the brain's capacity to be plastic. Yeah, a lot of exciting stuff going on. And one of our speakers is coming up in a few weeks. Davin Quinn also is here doing a lot of TBI research with brain stimulation as well. So I think that throughout the course of this echo, we'll have a lot of information to share hot off the presses about innovations in treatment for our populations.
Excellent.
Say again?
That's excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to jump right in because I know I always butt up against the time. And thank you for running the slides from there. It's very much appreciated. I think first I need to say that I have nothing to disclose that is related to the content of this echo. And so let's jump right into the next slide and just talk about what working memory is. This is just a graphic, and I've tried to list as many notes and as much text as possible in the notes pages of these PowerPoints. So if you're looking for some references or any notes or links to some of the information that I'm providing on here, it should be in the notes pages of the PPT or PPTX document, just for your reference. But this is a nice visual, I think, to kind of tell the layman and to tell your patients sometimes like what working memory is. It's not actually very straightforward to get a whole lot of information about working memory from the literature, because oftentimes it's listed under the attention recommendations and attention literature. It's sometimes been called working attention or the central executive, which is part of the scratch pad model that we're about to talk about. So it's actually not as straightforward as you think to try to tell people to look up information about working memory. If you'll go to the next slide, that graphic was really based upon the main theoretical account of working memory processing, which was developed by Baddeley back in the early 80s and has been updated over time. And Baddeley's model suggested three main components, the first of which is the central executive, which I just mentioned. You can actually find some literature out there talking about, remediating the central executive, and they're referring here to this main component of working memory. So the central executive is responsible for manipulation of information and also allocating attentional resources when completing tasks. And so this is why we have kind of this complex intertwining or relationship between working memory and attention. Now, it's very difficult to just test one and very difficult to just research one without doing also the other. There's also another theory out there of something called supervisory attentional control. The author's name is Chalice. I'm notoriously terrible at pronouncing names correctly without meeting a person. And so the central executive has been kind of lumped together if you are one who buys into the supervisory attentional control mechanism. That's very similar to what we're referring here to as the central executive. There's also two maintenance systems, which is specific to language, and this is the phonological loop. And the other is spatial information, which is the visual spatial sketchpad. And then the episodic buffer is tying these things to the episodes that are happening in real time. And then this model is also showing us how this information feeds into long-term memory. So things have to stay in short-term memory long enough, they have to be processed, they have to be salient enough to then make its way into long-term memory. If you go to the next slide, I like this explanation as well. It gives us other kind of definitions or descriptions. So the central executive, again, monitors and coordinates all other mental functions in working memory. The visual spatial sketchpad encodes visual information in terms of separate objects, as well as the arrangement of these objects in one's visual field. The phonological loop in blue is subdivided into the phonological store and the articulatory processes. It's for encoding speech sounds into working memory and involves maintenance and rehearsal. This is why it's called a loop, because you do have that maintenance and rehearsal. Then the episodic buffer in yellow is receiving input from many sources. It temporarily stores this information and integrates it in order to construct a mental episode of what is being experienced. And then again, is showing that these things are feeding into long-term memory. If you'll go to the next slide, last time when we talked about attention, we talked about where attention was housed. So we talked about the different levels of attention, but also where in the brain attention lived. And so I'd like to introduce to you what the literature says about where working memory lives, and then in the next slide do some, or in another slide, do some integration where I'm showing you how this interacts or overlaps with the information that we've discussed about attention. So where is working memory? Research, meta-analyses show us bilateral frontal lobes, bilateral parietal lobes, bilateral temporal lobes, left hemisphere bias to the frontal areas of Broca's, so Brodmann's area 44-45, and also the supramarginal gyrus, mixed occipital, so superior occipital, the right calcarine fissure, and bilateral fusiform. And then also there's some pretty interesting recent research showing the role of cerebellum. And this has led to some interesting treatments where actually brain stimulation has started to target cerebellum for language treatment, for cognitive communication, and for memory. And so maybe this is something that we can chat about later on in the echo in the months ahead as we learn more about these kind of treatments that are targeting the cerebellum. So the scope of the problem, a couple of these lines will look familiar because it is related directly to attention. Attention deficits are common following brain injury. They're very diverse, varied across our patients, and directly related to working memory. Working memory deficits are often described as a core feature of TBI, and working memory is thought to be a very important player in cognitive reserve, which is what also allows us to encode things into long-term memory. So I want to mention this cognitive reserve theory really quickly, and then take the next slide to get some of your opinions, either by unmuting yourself or by commenting in the chat on the side, because I wanted to just get your idea of what your thoughts are about cognitive reserve theory, how you see this or how you don't see this play out in real life with your participants or with your patients. So cognitive reserve theory is basically just simply saying that individuals with higher intellectual enrichment are more resistant to memory impairment that results from brain injury. And it's thought that working memory is a mediator of this relationship. So we have this limited capacity system for storing and manipulating, which is also encodes and binds things into long-term memory. Also, it's thought that working memory might be a mediator of the relationship between long-term memory, working memory, and intelligence. So if you go to the next slide, I just have a question because I'd like to get your thoughts about cognitive reserve theory, and just the simple version of this, where if you have higher intellectual enrichment, are you more resistant to memory impairment that results from brain injury? So if you could take a few moments to weigh in on that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Any thoughts on from anyone? I'm typing in Bueller.
Hi, this is Justin. As a clinician there, I seem to think that has a lot to do with many different things. For example, relationships that you have, because those are very taxing. I think we've talked a lot about fatigue. And as much, I mean, myself having a pretty significant brain injury, as much as I have exposure to, I want to show you guys my textbooks here that are required for us beautiful counselors to memorize. If I'm working too hard, nothing stays. I don't have any room for anything, even simple communications with relationships and stuff like that.
Mm. So how much do you think what happened before the brain injury, how much education, how much enrichment and exposure to educational opportunities, to different languages, to different experiences, how much do you think that increases or plays a role in being resistant to these memory impairments after the brain injury?
Again, that depends on my routine, my level of exposure to other things that I need to intake. I was pretty involved with learning how to speak 2 different languages at the time, and it was pretty academic. So I have been known to howl at the moon with my abilities, and then other times I'm just in bed, not able to work because I can do too many different things.
Right.
So it seems like you're saying mostly it relates to the cognitive reserve in the moment, like how many things you have going on at the time, not necessarily what your cognitive reserve might have been before the brain injury. Okay. Are there any thoughts? Any other people?
Hi, Jessica. This is Bob Carroll. I think there's multiple ways to look at this. One would be if you have better cognitive functioning prior to onset, for a given volume of damage, you are more likely to have alternative pathways and capacity outside the particularly damaged area. So given an amount of damage equal across a smart brain versus, a dumb brain, you've got reserve in the other parts of the smarter brain. I mean, that's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is given you're working at a certain level in life, but you have a lot more ability above that level. And so when you lose capacity, if you are smarter, then you are not yet quite lowered below your normal level of functioning in the real world. So the memory, etc. problems are not quite as apparent as it would be if you are just barely above the function you need to be and you get knocked out of your niche, and so the deficit becomes much more apparent. You could also look at it as a percentage of loss. That's another way to consider it. So if you have high capacity and you lose 10%, well, your capacity is still pretty high. Whereas if you are not very, quote, smart, which is not the right word, and you lose 10%, that's a much bigger blow to you. So I think there's lots of ways to look at it. But in general, I think the cognitive reserve theory makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just weighing in on that, I agree with you. And then I'm also looking at it from a functional perspective, and not just specific to memory, but if you are functioning at a higher level, you've probably acquired through life a variety of skills. So who's developed hobbies and other interests and other things that they've learned about, that are outside of that smaller bubble. When the facilities start to break down, I think that person still has access to all of those varied skills that they've developed through life. So I'm thinking about the person who has a brain injury who can no longer work. Well, they certainly are going to have more access to pursuing other interests other than just work. So I think in the long run, they end up doing better. And I know that's not just specific to memory, but I think it ties in.
Right.
I would agree with all of that. And also another way to think about it, when you talk with patients, they'll talk, they don't say cognitive reserve theory, but they talk about it in terms of, I'm okay most of the time doing my routine things, but when I need to kick it into another gear and pull up the rest of my resources, I don't have those resources. And they're explaining this reserve concept, even though they don't have the terms for it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you all. I have something, if we have time at the end, that relates to Bob, what you mentioned about different pathways. So I'll just kind of monitor the time to see if I have time to bring that up. If not, I'll make sure that it gets brought up in a future talk. So if you go to the next slide, I just wanted to show really quickly, just to help integrate how some of these anatomical areas for working memory overlap with our previous lecture that we had about attention. And so I've just highlighted in black areas of attention that are also covered by areas involved in working memory. And you can also see that this involves all of the levels of the hierarchy of attention, which does explain, again, why in the literature and in research, attention and working memory are very much married together. So if you'll go to the next slide, I just had this slide here. I'm not going to say what's on it. We said it the last time we met. This is just how the ACRM and the Cicerone group present their recommendations as practice standards. And you see what makes something a practice standard, a practice guideline, or a practice option. I also included on the next slide how INCOG decides what their level of evidence is and what is the strongest evidence. And so they have, instead of the standards and guidelines and options, they have supported by level A evidence, level B evidence, and level C evidence. And so what you'll actually see on the next slide is pretty much a repeat of recommendations from the ACRM group for attention, and just as they apply to working memory. So they really do include working memory as part of attention, and so the practice standards and the practice option that they provide for clinicians are the same. So post-acute, it seems to be quite effective. There's the most support for that. Direct attention training, but contextualized is best. Metacognitive training, and that's actually going to be a theme that we're going to see pretty much throughout all of the ACRM recommendations, is the importance of metacognition and metacognitive activities for overall efficacy and, of course, for generalization. And then as a practice option, computer-based interventions as an adjunct to clinician-guided treatment of attention deficits. And this is a little different to think about, because actually most of our kind of effective and efficient and most of our working memory treatments that make the most sense in terms of how you deliver them and what the patient is doing, most of them are actually computerized. And so it's kind of difficult to think about, well, how could I do this better as a clinician one-on-one? I think this computerized treatment might actually work even better. And so I have some ideas that are kind of from the literature that kind of help us to resolve some of those questions. If we go to the next slide, these are actually the INCOG recs, and I put highlighted metacognitive. So we have some agreement with the INCOG group that metacognitive strategy training is very important. Also, they specify severity. So whereas the ACRM was talking more about acute, subacute, or chronic, and the post-acute had the most support, the INCOG is talking also about severity. And they're saying that this is really most effective for mild to moderate attention deficits. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it for people with other severities, but in terms of what the literature is telling us, this is what we have the most support for. And the examples that they have from the literature specifically are that time pressure management, which we talked a little bit more about in depth last lecture, that actually led to improved memory and working memory function. Metacognitive strategies to increase how well someone allocated their attentional resources, plus explicit discussion of application of strategies. This led to improved working memory. Working memory training, very specific in-back tasks, which we'll discuss in a little bit, led to improvements in working memory. And so that is the evidence that led them to their recommendations from INCOG. If you go to the next slide, this is, again, where things just, I think, make it a little harder for us as clinicians and researchers to navigate, because you have one saying that we'll deliver computerized as an adjunct and it needs to be contextualized. And whereas the INCOG recs are saying computer-based attention tasks are not recommended based on lack of basically generalization to anything in real life, which I think we could probably kind of all agree with to a degree. But honestly, the working memory research that they're pulling from is not a whole lot there. There's not a wealth of working memory computerized. They're really pulling from the broader attention literature. So it's really difficult to say how much of that applies to working memory, how much of that is just attention, because they're really talking about like attention process training. What do we do with that information as clinicians? So what I thought was that I'd really briefly go through just what they actually did in the studies that worked. So because I think we have an idea of what working memory or the attention training might have been, but I just pulled out the methods and the description of the working memory activities that they did in the studies that had the most powerful effects and the biggest effect sizes. And so that's what these next slides are. If you'll look at the next slide where it's showing from the Cicerone 2002, and I just included the title. It started with remediation of working attention if you wanted to do a Google Scholar search. Also, the link is in the notes pages of the PowerPoint if you want to go look up the article. But basically, they did these in-back tasks. They did 1-back, 2-back, 3-back tasks. And it was either experimental experimental paced or self-paced. And then they did 1-back, 2-back, 3-back tasks, but they also had, and this was actually not computerized. They're actually laying out cards, and they had to, for the 1-back, they had to remember if the card that they were seeing matched the number on the card that they saw before. If it was a 2-back, it was, okay, you lay down a series of cards. Does this card match the one that you saw 2 cards before? So you're having to continuously update your working memory. And the 3-back, of course, gets a lot harder. It doesn't seem very linear if you go from a 2-back to a 3-back. 2-back, you're like, okay, it can handle this. And then 3-back, the world kind of falls apart. We actually have some researchers here who are doing 5-back tasks, and I don't even know how they do that. So they raised the level of difficulty where they did 1-back, 2-back, 3-back, but they also had to name the color. And then a similar thing, and then they had to sort by suit. They also did in-back with intermittent verbal generation so that they were doing in-back tasks, but they also had to name something in a semantic category, or they had to make up a letter triad that couldn't be a real word, couldn't be an abbreviation. So it's quite a complex task. So really adding this cognitive demand on top of a working memory. And then it in-back with a continuous secondary task. So this was the actual training that they did in the study that is relied upon a lot to give us these working memory recommendations. If you go to the next slide, this series of 4 to 5 slides is from the same study, and I basically just took screenshots of their appendix where they listed what they did in their working memory training in the study. And so I'm just going to list the description that's italicized, and then the further description is in the article and on the slides as well. So they did words from oral spelling. So the therapist spelled out a word, and then the person had to figure out what word it was. Oral spelling with a letter omitted, regular, just oral spelling, odd or even number of letters in a word, reconstitution of words from syllables, And a lot of these are very fine lines between, well, what's a working memory task and is this just a regular straightforward phonological task? But as we know, the working memory model includes the phonological loop, so it makes sense that a lot of these working memory tasks will involve playing around with phonemes, playing around with sounds. Alphabetic way, so the therapist presented a letter and a calculation, and they had to find the target letter. So B plus 6 equals H, E minus 2 equals C. Word sorting in alphabetic order. So we'll go to the next one, acronyms, 2D mental imagery, so this is more visual spatial, and 3D mental imagery, so now we're going into that visual spatial, and finally visual in back, which is kind of what we were talking about before with the cards, with the 1 back, 2 back, and 3 back. So that was the working memory training that they actually used in the study, that again is relied upon very heavily for a lot of our working memory recommendations. If you go to the next slide, this is a 2007 study. And what they did was that they just actually repeatedly gave a test, which probably a lot of us as assessors kind of hate when, and part of a treatment study, they've gotten a test that you're going to give them over and over again. But they gave the paced auditorially serial addition test, and then they made up 2 tasks that they were inspired by the PASAT. And this is a month's task and a words task. And I actually just have an explanation on the next slide. So if you look at months, if the first 2 months presented were January and June, then they had to say which month was first. So this is January. And then if the 3rd month was August, they had to remember the 2nd month from the previous presentation and then do that comparison and say that June was before August. And then if they did a words, excuse me, so if the first 2 words presented were spaghetti and pomodoro, the participants could take they were taking the 3rd letter of the first word, and then they would have to remember 1 word behind it and then take the 3rd and generate a new word. So they're having to keep things in working memory, but also play with that information. So pretty nice tests of manipulating the information that you have in working memory. So I wanted to ask you just here, like what methods similar to this or completely different from this that you might be incorporating from your practice or from your research. And then I believe that Dr. Pedrati is going to go over potentially some computer-based, and I have 3 or 4 slides of some supported computer programs for working memory training as well that you can have in your toolbox. So what working memory methods do you have from your practice, or is this something that you don't really focus on or haven't thought about? So is this something that is not really a focus? So see, I don't.
So, so if this is not, if this is new for everybody, this is wonderful because this is part of the whole issue of integrating the therapy with the cognitive components. And the issue I think that is being put forth that we are trying to discuss is this notion of working memory kills you in the office in therapy and kills you when you're talking with your friends because you don't hold in your the initial part of the training is attention, and then when people can't pay attention long enough they forget, but the next step is rehearsing and reminding yourself what is actually being said, and then that switches all the way up to executive functioning. So when you go into plan and you're missing pieces, you begin to realize you can't plan the way you used to. So the idea with the developmental metacognitive approach is that this working memory step is essential to building the skills using metacognitive in practice, so people can actually jump between attention and the executive function, the planning stuff. So when you all are doing work with people, how do you begin to target or see this issue of working memory? And then what, if anything, would you do to address it? I think is the other way to ask the question.
Yeah.
So what do you all think?
So I think that a lot of times what I see is that working memory is not really kind of pulled out as something separate. That when people are talking about attention, they may be talking about working memory without even bringing it up or knowing exactly that they're accessing that. And then when they're talking about memory, they're talking about memory and doing things that are evidence-based and that make sense for memory, and it may involve a working memory component, but it's not directly addressed. So what I see is that it kind of sits like in no man's land and doesn't always get directly addressed in a way that I think, at least the evidence shows us, that would be very beneficial, because it seems to be a very important mediator.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so Dr. Hubble, I have sat with the client doing tasks on his own with the Velocity account, so I can see his approach. He otherwise does it on his own at home, but impulsivity skips through it. Yes, I'd like to incorporate something more formally in practice. Okay, so why don't we take this time? I'll jump into to something I do, then you can show what you use, and then we can move on to the case. Just so you all know, for what it's worth, Dr. Richardson is doing a fabulous job of switching the didactic model today, of actually encouraging everybody to communicate. We've been talking about how that's a better way to do echo. So 2 thumbs up, Dr. Richardson, because I'm going, how did she do that? Anyway, really good. So I'll show you. What I use is, Dr. Latch came out a long time ago here, and she taught us something from Neuropsych Online and also like Science Associates. I'll show you something we use in Neuropsych Online, but there's also Cog Smart that someone had suggested they use. And then there's Posit Science, the brain stuff that Posit Science has as well. So the point to this is that you want errorless learning, so you have to develop a task that people can be successful at first, so they're not cheating. And if they are cheating using compensatory strategy, at least they learn to cheat in public. So that's like writing things down. But I'll show you on share screen, if I can pull this up, new share. So I'm going to get out of this for a second, I think. And here we go. Now I'm going to close this for a minute, right? Sure. And then I'm going to, yeah. All right, so this is the Neuropsych Online. This is Odie Bracey's stuff out of Indiana. You can get training on it if you want. Again, we're not saying you should do one specific type of thing, and you can go get all the training you want, but this is one way it works. One of the nice things about this you'll see is that it's automated, so when the person's at home, when they use it, it rotates through like a carousel. In the office, you use manual, and then you can set up a prescription pad, so you can basically set up what you want the person to do at home. So for working memory, what I do is I run down to executive. I know that's really not what it is. And we do something, there's a digit symbol transfer. So those who know the Wisconsin, those who know the whisk and the waste, they have this. And so, for some reason, I can't get the full screen. There we go. So here, this is basically, I clicked on it. Sorry about it. I'll do it again. Sometimes I just stumble through this. So we go here to digit symbol transfer. This is a working memory task that's kind of more sophisticated in a sense. And they used to do it where they started with 3 digits and 6 digits and 9 digits. Now you get all the digits thrown at you. And you used to be able to just keep the digits and the symbols connected. You didn't have them change, so you could learn to memorize them and then get your speed going on that as well. But basically, this is a task where you have the 9 symbols on the top and the numbers on the bottom that correlate with it. So you tell them, find the symbol, then find the numbers for 6 here, so you go to 6. And then you go all the way across, and it times you on this as well. So it's actually asking you to do this under 100 seconds. And so you basically can sit with somebody, and if you're going to do errorless learning, if this part here of finding the numbers on the side is hard, you could be the one. They tell you the number, and you could click on the number yourself. So you could be the one helping them. But what you're beginning to do is teaching them not to freak out and to relax and to concentrate. And some of them begin to fall apart near the end. They make some mistakes. And then eventually they get better at this. And now you say, well, how does this generalize? So they begin to be able to concentrate on the task. begin to switch between kind of what they're doing and remember what they're doing simultaneously. So this is one thing they can do that I run them through, and it goes from a slow expectation to a very fast expectation. In regards to the one-back technique that was being stated, this has a one-back technique in it as well that you can use, where it gives you numbers and it asks you to remember the number that was seen before. This kills some of the people in what they do. So there's serial addition, there's a sequence, there's this task here where you have to do the alphabet backwards in a certain amount of time. So you have to kind of pull it up in your head and you have to start going. And you can help them through this as you want. And you don't have to stick to the time as long as they're learning to do it. And then if they can get faster, that's good. So that's another technique. And then there's the one that basically we all know and love. Okay, maybe not. Is this one is digits backwards, right? Everybody knows it has visual and auditory digits backwards. And so here you just have to basically, I always click on the wrong one. Here it basically presents digits to you, and then you have to remember them in reverse order. And if you wanted to start it with digits forwards, you can, but if you know the working memory is the big issue, then basically you start here. So this is where you're selecting, do they need attention or do they need basically working memory? And again, you just help them begin to learn how to do this. You can kind of add with them. You can do the clicking if you want. You can help them rehearse if you want. And so, but basically you're asking them to just remember how to do it, and then it just keeps going. And it goes up to about 8 digits backwards. So this gives you the rehearsal part, and it begins to have them be aware of what they need to do. There's a few other tests in here as well, but this is just kind of one of the ways. And when you make a mistake, it tells you, whoops, try that again, and then it helps you again. So I practice these in the office, then I set it up for them to do it at home, and then we just figure out what we're going to do from there. Okay?
And there's a question mark, and they're asking if it's accessible to anyone, the site.
Yes. Yeah. So anybody can get on this site. They can purchase a membership per month with this. I think it's $20 a month, and you as a therapist can get in and manipulate it as well with them. Or you can just get it for your office, and then you can have them use it in your office. Or you could set up what we have at Kerry Tingley is that we have a license for like 25 slots, and basically we assign them a name, and then basically they can go home and use it on our account, not on their own private, not on their own dime. So we pay for it here at the university. So.
And if I could just comment here too, I know that a lot of the working memory tasks that we see, a lot of them are more biased towards the visual spatial and not as much of the phonological loop. And there are a lot of things that you can do with the phonological loop that we do actually as part of phonological therapy. And then when we work with TBI patients, we're like, oh, this is working memory therapy for them. But like where, you give them a word or you give them 2 words. And, so for example, the first word is bait. And the second word, I should have prepared this, is heart. And then you tell them, in the first word, take out the A, what is the word? And then in the second word, take out this, what is the word? What's your new word? And so you're having them manipulate the phonology, taking out sounds and then coming up with new words and then adding them together. And so it's quite effective for working memory strategies in a way that's not just leaning on just the visual spatial part of the working memory model. Having said that, a lot of times when you have patients with cognitive deficits who also have language issues like alexia or dyslexia or agraphia, we have other things that aren't commercially available. We do have presentation, or that's a presentation software that don't rely on letters and don't rely on numbers. They are pictures. So we have what we call a fruit bat task instead of in back with letters where they're having to match letters. They're having to match fruit shapes because a lot of our patients who have had stroke and sometimes TBI, they can't really recognize the letters for what they are. So we we've had to be a little creative about how to access working memory while not biasing it towards it being a linguistic task.
Right. And this is the beauty of it. And hopefully, as we continue to move through and look at cases, and in the case conference part of it, a consultation, we can begin to talk about these different skills that you can be trying in the session. Because when you're actually doing therapy with somebody and they can't recall what you just said 5 minutes ago, you're done. They're trying to relate. And so then the therapy becomes interesting in the sense that you all are working on trying to rehearse what is really going on in the therapy, and then moving to a phenomenological experience of what is that like out in public or in your family when you're getting lost. And what we talk about with people with working memory issues is they confabulate too much. And then they could start getting into arguments of people are misunderstanding what they're saying. And the street word for confabulation is BSing. And so when people are like, they're always just making stuff up, you're like, no. They're trying to keep up, but they're just pulling stuff out of the air, and you need to slow it all down and help them remember what's going on. All right, so we got to run to the next piece. But what I like is I think we're getting into a stride here on how to kind of present some of this stuff in a way and add the different components to it. So I'm really excited about what you've done today, Dr. Richardson, so thank you. It's really good.